Did you miss me? Alright. Uh as the text on screen says, hi. Um yeah. Xenogenders again. Cause this topic has not like been covered enough. No, but unironically. Um there is always more to say. And a friend of mine put forward a very interesting idea, and hey, I want to talk about it because it's an interesting idea. So, as you probably saw from the thumbnail, it's very Matrix Resurrections themed, and I have thoughts about that movie. It's disappointing. It could have been good, but it wasn't. Anyway, Xenogenders Resurrections, another sequel that wasn't asked for, but you're getting anyway. Much like Matrix Resurrections. Anyway, all right. Hello. Um. So what's the fuck? Why? Why is my hotkey is broken? I'm going to have to fix that real quick. Actually. Um. That's that one. That's that one. Okay, cool. Okay, that was just a mispress by me. Anyway, what is the plan? I'm going to recap what Xenogenders are. Then I'm going to delve into the theory that underpins what my friend suggested. And then I'm going to tie it all back into why this relates to gender and Xenogenders more specifically. Alright. So what are Xenogenders? Let me just, there we go. That's readable. Chat is not readable, but you can read chat. Yeah, so as you probably remember, because you're totally a very avid viewer of me, in my last stream I basically described it as like gender that exists completely outside of the binary and outside of normal conceptions of gender, right? So stuff that's just completely out there, like cat gender or aesthetic genders. So this could then be summarized as, well, hyper-individualized experiences of gender. And as I've noted on the slide, this is a fun MacGuffin that we'll pick up again later because it kind of underpins this whole like idea, right? And also we'll take a second to appreciate the photo editing I did to make that stock photo seem more matrixy by making everything all blue and washed out. Because that's how it is, right? It has to be blue and washed out to be Matrix themed. Right. So, theory. Gender is a social construct. That's an uncontroversial. That uncontroversial statement. And there's a lot of writing on this. There are many like people that have written on the social aspects of gender as a construct within society. My favorite, as you know, is Judith Butler, absolutely goated author, but not the only author that has conceptualized of gender as a social construct, right? There's many people, like over the past like couple decades, you know. Now, as it's a social construct, it's created by society, right? So, I guess I'll address in this point that gender itself, I don't believe, and I don't think there's really evidence to suggest that gender exists a priori or before society, right? You need a society for gender to exist. That doesn't say then, though, that stuff like gender dysphoria doesn't exist, because gender dysphoria, at least the social component of like how people treat you, that like kind of implicitly comes from how people treat you, right? However, the actual like physical aspects, right, the incongruence between what the brain thinks should be there and what actually is there, that could exist without society, because it's simply a matter of like your brain being like, this body's not quite right. And in 2022, we conceptualize of that as gender dysphoria and specify it's like physical dysphoria, right? So that would exist without society, but we wouldn't necessarily call it gender dysphoria. Maybe we'd call it sex dysphoria, but if you're cool like me and think that sex itself is a social construct and the underlying biology is all that exists, and the interpretations of that we call sex and biological sex, yeah, that's a social construct as well. Anyway, point is, gender does not exist without society. So to say that, like that's, I think that, yeah, suggesting that someone like would always be a given gender, like someone would always be cloud gender, right? I don't think that that's necessarily accurate. Which pulls us to the next point: capitalism and individualism. Noticing a link yet? So, according to people like Baudrillard, simulacra and simulation. Very interesting piece of work. But essentially, we're in the late stage of capitalism, right? And in this late stage of capitalism, we are like experiencing kind of like the hyperreal, right? We're not experiencing the underlying real thing, and in fact, it's been destroyed, right? And so all we have left then is the like simulation, the hyperreal simulation of a real that no longer exists. So this can apply to social constructs and to social connections, right? That's the cool thing. So if we conceptualize of gender as a social construct in its entirety, right, we could see that even though gender may have existed in a specific way 150, 200, 300 years ago prior to capitalism and exists in non-capitalist societies today, that doesn't necessarily mean that we in our late stage capitalist society necessarily have that real underlying gender anymore. And instead we are kind of applying the hyperreal version of that gender, right? The masculinity and femininity that exists today maybe isn't the masculinity and femininity and etc. that existed 100 years ago. And in fact, there are, like, if you look at it from a conservative perspective, right, they recognize that, right? They're like, oh, where are all the real men gone, right? They want a 1950s conception of masculinity that perhaps doesn't really exist anymore. And they're just trying to live up to a hyperreal simulacrum of 1950s masculinity. So then, what can we draw from this? I wrote very philosophically and academically, gender qua social construct is perhaps falling apart to be replaced with gender qua personal identity. So that's the thing, right? Maybe that is what's happening, and that's where xenogenders kind of arise, in that social connections and as a result social constructs kind of get torn apart in late stage capitalism, and gender as a deeply social act, as it would have been 100 years ago, 200 years ago, right? In the sense that someone performs their gender and someone performs masculinity or femininity or some other non-binary gender, because, well, non-binary genders, right, third genders and so on, existed prior to capitalism, and in some places actually do still exist, right? So that, like, and like looking particularly at third genders, right, they often have a spiritual role, right? That is implicitly a social act, right? Someone doesn't really choose that in the same way that they grow into that role, right? So let me take an example from the West to make it kind of clearer, right? If you look at various, well, we can't really describe them as trans-masc individual because, again, these conceptions didn't exist like 150 years ago at the time of, like, for example, the US Civil War, right? But there were certainly assigned female at birth individuals, right? AFAB individuals that took on the roles of masculinity, right? That took on the roles of manhood and performed that. And it was more of a deeply social thing. And we see the echoes of that in, like, the way that these people were more so, like, playing a role in society rather than existing and describing their gender in terms of how they personally experienced it, right? So if you look at how gender discourse works nowadays, though, there is certainly that idea of, like, personal gender identity, right? So it's like, it's not necessarily bad. Also, hello. Um, yeah. So the idea that gender is kind of becoming a more personal thing rather than a social role to inhabit is not necessarily a bad thing. Again, like, as I probably should have mentioned at the very start of this, I'm not here to invalidate people that strongly identify with xenogender labels or other microlabels, right? I'm just here to try and understand how they work in terms of, like, the sociological mechanism. And yeah, I think it's really cool. I'm a sociology nerd, okay? Um so that's the thing, right? Now, I mentioned discourses around, yeah. So in on this slide in particular, I mentioned queer Tumblr, queer Twitter, right? I have my quarrels with especially queer Twitter, but I think that these, like, platforms and the discourses. Wait, my current game is Neo. There we go. But, like, that's the idea, right? Like, this notion of, like, um the discourses and the notion of gender as being a deeply personal thing rather than what sociologists have kind of been looking at for a long time as, like, being a social realm that people inhabit, right? It's like, it's very interesting, and it does. I do believe, and I think my friend who kind of put me in this direction would also believe that, yeah, like, this is a result of capitalism. um and so the way that people have shifted from describing gender as the space they inhabit or the space they want to inhabit, they shift to gender is the way that they exist and the way that they describe it, I think is really interesting. And like, yeah, so it's like that idea of capitalism dismantling social constructs plays really well into this because, yeah, gender is not being a social construct anymore, at least in the conception of, especially, like, queer Tumblr, right? Because that's kind of where this started. It kind of started as, like, trans people seeking solidarity, and then the non-binary community kind of exploding on there, right? And as I make a big note of here, fucking with the foundation of gender is good, actually, and I deeply agree with that. Like, fucking with the foundations of gender is exactly what people like Butler said, right? That the oppressive binary system, the heterosexual matrix, is not a beneficial thing, right? Like, it exists, sure, but that doesn't mean it's a good thing, and it doesn't mean that we can't, like, dismantle that matrix by, questioning what the foundations of gender are and questioning whether it should be conceptualized in the way that it is. Because, well, gender is just a social construct at the end of the day. It's deeply important to many people, but, I mean, the way that it forms its importance is, like, part of it is that it's imposed by society, right? As Butler says, we are impelled into a specific role. We're impelled into manhood or womanhood, right? And then when people are like, hey, I don't like either of those, that's where you get problems. And so, yeah, the discourse of Okay, yeah. So the discourse. I think another key component of where this sort of individualized conception of gender came from is like um specifically like liberal capitalism, right? The whole like rights based ideas of who's valid and stuff, right? So the hyper individual experiences of gender kind of play into that in the sense that, oh, a person has to innately be a thing in order to deserve rights, right? Like a person is, I don't know, fucking Romanian, right? Like a person is does not become Romanian. A person has always been Romanian, right? Like me. Hi. Hello. Uh but like that's the thing, right? Like within human rights discourse, you kind of have to have a claim as to why you deserve rights. And treating it as, oh, gender is a thing that is part of the brain or is deeply personal and exists outside of society is very appealing to that, right? And it's very appealing with these liberal human rights discourses. And capitalism is more than happy to keep fostering that because if you tie your gender to consumption, like for example, Crimson Forest gender, right? That's you're tying your gender to the aesthetic of a video game that you buy, a video game made by a company that sells products, right? And so like that's capitalism is more than happy to provide. As long as you're not really questioning the foundations of capitalism itself, it's happy to subsume everything, right? And this is really cool. I don't know. Um the idea that maybe xenogenders are a result of the progression of liberal capitalism, right? And I think I'd like to wrap up this kind of discussion with well, let 100 flowers blossom and 100 genders contend. The person that said the original quote that I edited probably would not be very happy, and that's good because they should be spinning in their grave. They can go fuck themselves. Um, but I think that's like being very much like okay with like gender diversity, right? Is a net positive. And if at the end of the day, these like this is what gender becomes, right? It becomes a hyper individualized description of personal identity. I mean, that's destabilizing the binary foundations of gender, and that's good. Popla, that's me. Hello. But yeah. I think that's all I really wanted to say about gender. And maybe I should have done this as like a video, but anyway, what are my sources? Well, as you probably saw in the description, my friend, yeah, that's who Bentoscrub is. Baudrillard and capitalism. I will admit that I have only really read Simulacra and Simulation. I haven't read more of his work, but I think that that's like drawing on the ideas that he wrote about more broadly and not just in simulacra and simulation is like it's like that's fine, right? Like it's clearly influenced by that. And then lastly, yeah, Butler on gender as always. Yeah. Anyway, I did a lot of rambling. Um, guess how do I summarize all that I've really talked about? Um, Capitalism, human rights discourses, directly produced xenogenders as an individualization of the social construct of gender. There we go. And if you want to actually try and understand how I came to that conclusion, the past 20 minutes would probably be helpful. um, but yeah, I will stick around for another few minutes or a minute or two. I don't know. If people have questions about this, um, I'm very happy to try and answer them. So I will just sit here. Hmm. Actually, no, I'll take a sip of my tea. It's probably cold by now. tea. Yeah. They should make gender into a tea, because it'll probably be quite tasty. There's a lot to unpack, and sometimes tea has a lot of flavors to unpack. Alright. Yeah. Would you recommend any books or authors? Yes, so that's the problem, right? Isn't it? Um, if you like, yeah, you can't really like read about specifically this, like the link that's drawn between these in describing xenogenders, because lots of people don't really write about xenogenders yet, right? I maybe I should do a master's in sociology and write about this, hey. Um, but no, like as I said though, like um in terms of like the capitalism, social construct, social structures being dismantled type stuff, that's Baudrillard. And you can definitely see some of like, especially I mentioned like simulacra and simulation multiple times. That would be a good book to read, a good piece to read, in the sense that it describes how well capitalism creates the hyper real, right, and destroys the real underneath, and it stops existing. Um, then yeah, in terms of the gender stuff, there's a paper that I think I linked in my previous stream, like the ego hippo. It's not HIPAA. It's not HIPAA compliant. Doesn't do any medical research, but yeah, ego hippo. That paper is kind of interesting in the idea that it kind of is like, well, throwing away traditional gender can be revolutionary, right? And it can be like, it kind of tackles the idea that the conflict between materialist feminism and more like um queer feminism that kind of discards that, right? Because this would be kind of at that intersection, right? It would be at the idea that like, well, gender is falling apart, right? And so that would definitely be a piece. Gender Trouble in Bodies That Matter by Butler, of course, always. That's kind of the underpinning of how I conceive of gender and like the social construction of gender. And yeah, I guess that would be the books that I would recommend. Um, yeah. Hopefully, I should probably put that in the chat, shouldn't I? Yes, I will. Um, what is that matter? Um, yeah, there we go. That's the works that I am drawing on when I make my assertions. And I guess like, if I, okay, gonna minorly dox myself. I'm like a year off graduating from like a bachelor's level degree. If I hypothetically do a master's and actually write about this as part of like a master's of arts research or whatever the fuck it's called, right? Watch out for that, hey. um, because yeah, if I do go into academia, I will definitely be writing about this. Hmm. Yeah. Any other questions? Or yeah, because I do still be here. I like how I have to look all the way over there for chat, because the chat that's like actually on my main monitor is kind of delayed. The one on my secondary monitor is like, you know, it's fine, fast, but it's also all the way over there. Oh well. Um, yeah, gender. If you don't like gender as much and you just want to watch me play games, well, this week's gonna be good for that, I guess. Um, I'll be playing probably near again. Maybe not Fortnite. We'll see. And probably Minecraft, because I have ideas on how to like make Minecraft interesting, even though I'm in a single player world. So watch out for that, I guess. Should be fun. Um, if you do want to see me talk about gender more, there's also my original Xenogenders video. I think this one kind of supersedes it though. Like if you want an understanding of what Xenogenders are and not really like pay attention to the mechanisms I describe by which they work, then yeah, that previous video was good. But this one expands on the actual like mechanics by which they work more, I think. And I really want someone to write about this like academically, and it's unfortunate that I'm not literally doing a sociology degree as like a full like research degree. But yeah, I want someone to write about this. Anyway, uh, no more questions. That's fine. You could always tweet at me if you do have more questions. I know some people actually have been doing that, which is pretty cool. My Twitter's up there, poplar underscore, because the underscore one's my private account. I also have a Discord as well. I don't know where I'll link that. You know what? I'll link in this video right now. Edit invite link. Don't expire. Generate. There we go. Discord. So yeah. If you have questions, Twitter or Discord. But for now, I will take my leave. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble, and I'll hopefully see you another time where I'll be playing games instead. Bye bye.